Well, thank you very much. I got to tell you, this is my second opportunity to see that. That just never gets old. I'll tell you right now. I've had many introductions in my day, but never one quite so honorific. I'm surprised I can fit my head in this church. In all seriousness, it is my great honor and privilege to be here today, and I mean that sincerely. My encounter with this church has been wonderful. It is not my first encounter. I was telling the good Reverend that my mother, some of you may know, Pam Winder, attended here some years back. She has since passed, but she came here for her spiritual enthusiasm, and she enjoyed it greatly. So we're not a stranger to this congregation. As I said, it is my great honor and privilege to be here, and as the Reverend indicated, it is my goal to discuss some issues that are both contentious, but I hope enlightening at the same time. And after I conclude my remarks, I hope to offer sufficient time to receive your questions where we can get into those issues that I maybe don't have time to address. The issue at hand today is, as the Reverend indicated, one of bias. In our country, we are polarized. We have become a culture to some extent, or are increasingly a culture, in which we perceive things in very limited ways. We judge. We judge people by many factors. We judge people by the car that they drive, or the school that they attend, or the neighborhood in which they live, or the color of their skin. And, of course, we can judge each other by how we look in other ways, including, in my instance, the uniform that I wear. Today I came intentionally in my uniform, not to spur further controversy, but because I am very proud to wear it and to identify myself for what I am. That is your servant, a public safety officer and a police officer. I'm not ashamed of this uniform, but increasingly when I am contacted by individuals, they judge me by the uniform I wear, rather than what is in my heart or my soul or my mind. That is bias, a bias that should not be tolerated, just as the bias of an officer treating someone based on the color of their skin should not be biased. We need to do more to break down in our communities the idea that it is us and them, high, low, rich, poor, south, east, whatever division you want to place onto it. We've got to shed ourselves of that predisposition and instead look at each other through the eyes of neutral, brother and sister, husband and wife, congregant, community member. These are the labels that we should attach to each other, but unfortunately today we do not. I will also comment on one thing that the Reverend said. He talked about in this country there has been demonstrated injustice in communities across this country, specifically in Ferguson. And he enumerated several others. I think it is important that we do not identify each individual community in the collective either, but take into account that each community does come with its set of challenges and its set of benefits. Salt Lake is not Ferguson, Missouri, nor do we want to become Ferguson, Missouri. And I think it is important to talk about the mechanisms in which a community does become something that is out of control or something that is ugly. The history of racial injustice in our community, our country, predates all of us. In fact, it came across or arrived here with its first white settlers and has ebbed and flowed ever since. And in many portions of this country, that ebb and flow has not been exactly huge. There are pockets in our community, in our country, in which racism is still inherent and very obvious. And we must not overlook that. So let's talk a little bit about the reality of Ferguson, Missouri. First of all, it's important to note that in the United States of America, whether you understand this or believe this or not, the average size police agency is 30 officers or less. There are between 15 and 17,000 police departments in the United States of America. That statistic should shock you, because police agencies have done, in my opinion, a disservice to our broader community in that they have become micro agencies. They are small law enforcement agencies that are servicing individual populations. And on the surface, that may sound like a good thing. We all hearken back to the good old Mayberry days where Sheriff Taylor would police his community and everybody knew him and he was the town cop. Love it. I wish we could return to it. But the reality is those days to some extent have passed. What instead we see today is that communities like Ferguson, which encompasses approximately 6 square miles, hired a police department to service their local community and to maintain local control. A word that can have positive connotations, and in this instance, I believe, very negative connotations. What did local control mean in Ferguson? It meant hiring 50 white police officers and putting them in a 6 square mile jurisdiction in which they would be responding to predominantly African American constituency on a daily basis. To understand what a 50-man police department looks like in a jurisdiction of that type, let me put it in context. If you have 60 officers and you're running a patrol shift 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you need 5.5 officers to man every patrol car on a staffing basis. In other words, at any given time, you'll only have between 5 and 6 officers working in that jurisdiction. So 5 and 6 officers responding, unfortunately, to the same households, the same neighborhoods over and over again. Does this breed, Andy, of Mayberry communication? No, this breeds tension. Because the conflicts become personal. As I arrive every day for my job in Ferguson, Missouri as a white officer, and I know that I'm going to get the same calls of drug dealing and domestic violence and you name it, and I'm going to go to the same households and deal with the same individuals. Pretty soon, my bias becomes even more entrenched, does it not? Because now I know you not just as an individual whose call I'm responding to, but an individual I've dealt with over and over and over again. And likewise, the citizenry sees an officer not arriving in a uniform that is neutral, but sees Officer Smith or Officer Jones, who they know by name and know by character. Those tensions begin to evolve and erupt. And over a course of time, they do become personal. Now, meanwhile, what goose is watching the grain? The elected officials in that community, the city and city council and the courts, all of whom are extremely friendly with those same white officers and continue to empower them instead of overseeing them in a neutral fashion. So now I'll come a little bit to the positive side. Reverend Goldsmith indicated that we are in a community built on freedom. Emphasis on the word building. To suggest for a moment that our entire country is like Ferguson is outrageous. We have built institutions and we have come light years from where we were in the 1800s, the 1900s, the 1960s, the 1970s. We have built strong institutions, one of which is the Justice Department. And I applaud them for taking the actions that they have where they have gone and investigated. Deservedly and necessary, and I think the report will have tectonic shifts. But I certainly would invite the Justice Department to look at our own community, because we are not Ferguson. We do not have the historical implications that they have. We do not have the community tensions that they have. Not to say that we are perfect. There is much for us to do, but we should not lose sight of the fact that building is a continuous process. And you build upon a solid foundation and continue to make it stronger. What you do not do is have a solid foundation and begin to tear it apart because of misinformation or bias on either side. We must move forward. And we must move forward in a positive way, in which we do look at each other for what we are, which is individual human beings with individual needs, wants, and desires. I heard a whisper as I was sitting at my chair here when someone said, "The sheriff, what is the sheriff?" It's not an uncommon question, I'll tell you. My daughter's boyfriends all know who the sheriff is, I'll tell you that. But more than that, no. The sheriff, I am an elected official, honored to do so. I'm elected here by all citizens of Salt Lake County, and unlike in other areas of the country where the sheriff is relegated predominantly to civil process or to simply managing a jail, here your elected sheriff is responsible for a multitude of functions. First, I manage the Unified Police Department, which is our street law enforcement organization that responds to the 911 and other calls for service for nearly 400,000 of our Salt Lake County residents in multiple communities. In addition to that, I do manage not one jail, but 2. I have the Adult Detention Center, which is a 2,000-bed facility, which unfortunately is filled to capacity every day and has been for 15 years. I manage a second jail, the Oxbow facility, which is a 600-bed facility, which sadly is similarly at capacity. In addition to that, I manage the court security functions. Every time you enter into the 3rd District or the juvenile court house, you'll see an individual wearing a sheriff's uniform. Those individuals are there to provide security and support for individuals who have come to that institution to resolve the most important matters of their lives, both civil and criminal. Your Sheriff's Department here in Salt Lake County is one of the largest entities of government and has a total workforce of approximately 1,800 individuals and has a budget of nearly $200 million a year, all of which, ladies and gentlemen, is designed to do one thing. And the Reverend alluded to it. All of those resources are designed to serve and protect, and we do so in a multitude of ways. A multitude of ways that require understanding, require engagement, and require monitoring. That is my job, and I take it very seriously. And as I look at you today, I promise you that in our organization, we will simply not allow the kinds of issues that have caused Ferguson to erupt. We can never be perfect, but I'm a product of this community. I plan on living here for the rest of my life, as will my family, and therefore, we will live in a community that continues to build institutions that we can all be proud of. With that said, I'll be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff. And I'm going to be the roving microphone. Questions? Hands up. Okay, whoa. Oh, let me start in the back and we'll work our way up.
We got questions in the cheap seats too, I'll just tell you. Sorry, sir, you got to be a paying customer to ask. No, I'm just kidding.
I'd like to ask a question about de-escalation. What training has been ongoing in the recent past and in the distant past? And what would an example of a de-escalation in a confrontation, what would an example look like in the future?
It's just an excellent question, sir, and I'm going to answer, I've been asked to keep my answers as brief as possible, and so I'll try and answer what is a very complex question in 2 ways. First of all, de-escalation, what it looks like, is the ability of an individual to identify the differences between hostile, aggressive, continuing behavior and aggressive or frustrated behavior that has the opportunity to be resolved. I mean, if I were to provide a definitional approach to it. In terms of training, every officer, in fact I was mentioning this in the question answer, in the previous example, to put it in perspective, I am hiring officers today who will go to the academy, then they will come back, go through an in-service academy, then they will go into a field training officer situation. The officer that I hire today will not be working the streets of Salt Lake County until the end of January 2016. That is the length of time it takes to train an officer from start to finish. So within that training, there is a multitude of opportunities to learn the skills necessary to de-escalate. But what I will tell you on the other side is, remember that law enforcement is a reflection of our society. The men and women I hire come from your homes. And often they come with skill sets that are less than desirable. We live in a culture today of video games and isolation, in which young men and women have never had the opportunities, in some instances, to learn those very skills, sir. So when they come to our shop, we are at a bit of a disadvantage in some regards. So the other end of the spectrum is monitoring. What I believe, sir, is what teaches an individual how to appropriately de-escalate is time. Learning through successful repetition. Those that learn through unsuccessful repetition must be eliminated from service. And that is a risk, but it is a risk that we have to engage in to produce a law enforcement agency of any caliber. Does that make sense?
Thank you, yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for joining us, Sheriff. I'm a resident of Salt Lake County, and the thing I like best, I think can be most productive, is being proactive. I think you are, and your department is that way. But could you talk a little bit about what you do in poorer communities, the hot spots where you see the most crime taking place, to come to them like you're doing today and meet with them and ask for their suggestions on what can be done and how we can be more effective? Because if we're in communicating ahead of time with them and people are on your side, everything works better. Rather than being reactive.
Boy, isn't that the truth? And I will give you some specific examples of engagement in a variety of communities. And the Kearns community is a classic example. I think I spoke to a young lady just previously coming in who worked in the Kearns community. In the Kearns community, it has unique socioeconomic pressures. And so how we have engaged there is we have increased the number of school resource officers. Now that may sound like total placation. These are officers that work in and around the schools. But the role modeling provided by that officer in that school, the relationship is huge. I cannot tell you the number of kids. In fact, many of you, if you go and ask them, who's the policeman in your school, they'll tell you by name. And that impression is very important. Also the ability for individuals to communicate their individual problems to that officer, because oftentimes that's a great channel that we receive information of evolving situations. Abuse, neglect, drugs, you name it, comes through our school resource officers. In addition to that, we're engaging in a gang reduction initiative that is extremely exciting. And I won't bore you with the specific details, but suffice it to say this is an outgrowth of a program from the University of Utah in which we know that suppression alone does not resolve gang problems. Suppression is driving around in cars arresting people. What we know is prevention. Prevention is the key to success. Even long-term investigations does resolve it. So what we are doing is Gangs 101 courses. What do we do there? We go to individuals at meetings just like this and at schools by parents who do not believe their kids are in gangs. And we talk to them about some of the signs, symptoms, and behaviors. And you'd be amazed how many people will come and say, well, I thought little Johnny was just driving or writing 13 on his notebook because he liked the number. 13 is a gang symbol for one of the very prominent 13th Street gangs, or wearing particular colors, or you name it. And it starts a dialogue before the problem has happened, sir. So in each of our communities, we are trying to identify the specific needs and identify specific programs that address those needs, rather than taking the one-size-fits-all. So I hope that...
Do you meet with the community, though, and to establish a rapport with the citizens there, just like this?
We do, and you can hear from my voice. Look, I individually, I was telling the congregation in the previous meeting, not just since the Ferguson, but certainly it's been heightened, but I myself, I go out, I probably do, I can't tell you the number per week, between probably 4 and 5 community events that I do a week. But what we've recognized is that's not enough. So we're getting our individual officers to start taking on those responsibilities. We do it through community-oriented policing, but even that still is not enough. One of the frustrations I've had is we thought that Night Out Against Crimes or these crime fairs were a successful way to get out and engage in the community. And here's what I've identified, a positive outcome of the circumstances. I went to an event, in fact it was in Magna, and we had probably 20 police officers. You know, we had the canine guys and we had the community-oriented policing. And as I walked in the crowd, there was about 1,000 people from the Magna community. I looked, and where were all the cops? They were all huddled up together talking to each other. So what I had was the crowd walking back and forth by 20 cops who weren't engaging. And it totally hit me that, you see what I mean? If you tell a guy, go to a community fair, what does he hear? Go stand at a community fair. They're waiting for the public to break the ice when really it should be us that go in and wade in and do that. That is a paradigm shift that we're moving towards. And there's some other initiatives that I'd love to talk to you about that are on the horizon that are even broader than that. But does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Tom. Jim, I feel like your department is really well run, but occasionally you have problems where, say, young teenagers end up dead for one reason or another, and then it goes to probably a grand jury investigation. And if you look at the statistics around the United States, once something like that goes to a grand jury, the probability that they will find no fault with the police is almost 99.99%. In other words, it looks like it's not quite fair. I'm wondering, is there anything being done to address what seems like the grand jury system being a free pass for the police to just get out of? It's a good excuse for the prosecutor to say, no problem, go about your job. Are they looking at making that more fair, more unbiased in our area?
It's a tremendous question, and let me, sir, I hope I don't mean this negatively, but I will correct one perception that you outlined. We have a grand jury option. It is rarely, if ever, utilized. In fact, in the Cowley West Valley shooting situation, the district attorney, Mr. Gill, attempted to seat a grand jury and was unsuccessful in doing so. So in our community, the way it works is if we have an officer that is involved in a shooting, we have quite a robust protocol that outlines who will do the investigation. And that protocol involves a neutral outside agency. We've been doing this probably for 17, maybe even 20 years. So the investigation takes place, but here is how shootings are resolved in our community. Then the investigating body, which is usually made up of a detective from the agency officer was involved, the agency where the incident occurred, and a district attorney's quote-unquote neutral investigator, present that evidence to the district attorney, Mr. Gill in our case, and it is the district attorney and his staff who review the body of evidence associated with that case and make a determination as to whether it will be moved forward for prosecution or for not. That is the first and predominantly only step. Now, whether one agrees with that or disagrees with it, you need to know that system isn't even in place in other counties. They use a variety of different circumstances. So this year the legislature will pass a law that indicates that everyone has to use the same protocol, which I view as positive, because at least we'll all get on the same sheet. But it still does not resolve the underlying question that you provided, which is the perception on the part of the public that there is too much chumminess between those who review and those being reviewed. And, you know, again, I'm going to be frank, I'm a little bit at a loss to say how to really resolve that. In the Ferguson case, it went to a grand jury that was seated before the shooting. They came back with a recommendation, public didn't buy it. Then the district attorney presented the evidence online, people still didn't buy it. Now it's gone to the Justice Department for their clearance of the officer, and they have cleared him from criminal prosecution, and I guarantee you 75, 80% of people still don't believe it was fair. The question is, who do we trust to make those decisions? Somewhere the decision has to lie with an entity, and I hope that we don't lose faith in all of our elements, that we just say, well, there's nobody to trust. I happen to trust Mr. Gill and believe that in the instances I've seen that he has recommended prosecution on those cases that sufficient evidence was warranted. Long answer, but I hope that provides some answer.
You stated that the jails that you manage, they're filled to capacity. What steps do you as a police department take to lower the occupancy rates of these jails?
Sir, and the giggle is, trust me, I cry giggling every day. Look, the jail issue, and I want to keep my answers brief. The correction system in the United States of America is just absolutely broken. We incarcerate more people in the United States than any country in the world. 1 in 100 individuals are either in jail or in prison. Why? You're not going to like me saying this, because of y'all. Now, you're not going to like me saying that. Legislators pass laws, ladies and gentlemen, and who do legislators live with or work for? You. And over the last 30 years, what has been the most popular comment by any legislator, aside from, I'm going to fund education. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that does hurt my sides. I laugh so hard. No, every legislator wants to get elected, so they show up at community groups just like this, and they go, I want to be your legislator, and if you elect me, drug dealers, 3 times you're a loser. Okay, any 200 feet from a school, they're going to get a second-degree felony. Right? Okay, what they don't recognize is we know empirically that length of stay in incarceration has no impact on recidivism reduction. That's why we've been locking up people in droves over and over again. I joke that my jail is like a hotel that takes all reservations. They show up, I process them, period, end of story, and I'm in a triage for that. If we have time, I would love to talk to you about an initiative that's going on right now at the legislature and within our own organization that I hope will begin to change that. But the fact is, until we get a collective understanding that you can't beat a dog to make him work for you, we're going to keep locking him up, sir. And that's a cultural shift.
As I told you earlier, James Barker was someone very dear to me. And I have a little bit of issue with something you said earlier, that it's basically on-the-job training for an officer to learn how to de-escalate. And I spoke with an officer who told me they get about 12 hours of training in that whole time that you mentioned, from, say, now until January. 12 hours on de-escalation. And there doesn't seem to be any training on how not to escalate, not even to de-escalate. But if you see that video at James Barker, that police officer clearly escalated that situation. And why are they not taught more on how to not let a situation get escalated in the first place so you don't have to de-escalate? And another part of that, these investigations into these officers, the officer who killed him was considered justified in shooting him. If he had never got to that point, it would have never been a shooting to begin with. Why was the officer, maybe say at the end point, they say he was justified in murdering my friend. But what about investigating him for the fact that he clearly made that situation happen? And why is there no more training for these officers than that?
Yeah, I want to be very clear, and again, you may or may not like the answer that I'm going to provide to you, but if an officer that you've spoken to said that he had 12 hours of specific de-escalation training, that in and of itself does not necessarily shock me. In any given year, our officers are required by law and institutionally, we do 40 hours of refresher training. It doesn't seem like a lot, it isn't a lot, but it's what we are required to do, and within that, we provide a variety of components. But let me just talk about the on-the-job training, ma'am. And again, I want to answer you realistically. I don't care what job it is. You get a doctor that's never performed surgery, you got a higher risk of the surgery going bad than a doctor that has performed a dozen of them. Human nature is we do what we see as successful and continue it, and we improve on it, and we quit doing things that are unsuccessful and we don't improve on it. And I wish that I could say to you it's other than that. But the reality is, look, you get a young officer fresh out of school who is, he's got his costume on and he's ready to go, and it's the way it is. They're pretty full of themselves and have a particular impression. It does take a while for them to understand what the realities of their roles and responsibilities are, and we're mentoring them on a constant basis. What we hope to is plug them into an institution in which the collective perception and the collective belief is we won't tolerate excessive force. You plug them into an agency that does tolerate it, and you'll make them worse. So how we get them, and then we train them over a period of time and hope that it suppresses if they do have those tendencies. But ma'am, to say to you that we have devised a training that shows people how to resolve instances in every circumstance, I would be lying to you. There is no such training. Life is what prepares people to do that. And as far as the determination of why didn't he de-escalate or walk away from it, another reality, ladies and gentlemen, is this. People call us to resolve their problems. It is a it's a non-starter for an officer to arrive on a call from a person who's calling inside their home and says there's a suspicious person standing in my street or yard, and us to pull up, see the individual as hostile, get in our car and drive away. Ma'am, it cannot. The individual making that call expects the officer to communicate with that individual and attempt to resolve it. We can talk all day long about how it was resolved, but leaving was simply not an option. We have a responsibility both to the homeowner, to the caller, as well as the community to ensure that we try and resolve it.
So I have been living in Salt Lake City for about 25 years. As a language minority, I have seen Salt Lake City changed a lot. And we have more and more language minorities, from refugees to Latinos. You mentioned Kearns, which is 33% Latino, mostly Spanish-speaking. My question is, many of the countries that we come from, police are not our friends. In fact, they are the ones who persecute us, and that's why we're here. So what is the police department, the sheriff department doing to help us have a better relationship so we don't fear you and so you don't fear us also?
That is an excellent question, ma'am, and let me tell you, the people may not know it, but Salt Lake County is a significant recipient of a number of people that are being sent here from the State Department who are fleeing persecution from their own countries. We are a relocation site. And that demographic is changing every day, and they're coming from communities, ma'am, not only that are have little to no justice, but from individuals who have been treated, I just can't even describe it. They are coming here fearing for their lives. And it is extremely difficult to break into those communities. What the approach we have done this is with the very graciousness of John Price, and I'll just mention his name right now. He's a gentleman many of you are aware of. He's a philanthropist here. He has provided some funding to our organization in particular, in which we have an immigrant outreach program. And here's what we've done. We've identified cultural referential leaders who we meet with on a regular basis, and then they go out and communicate with individuals, and we have lunches and other events in which that cultural leader, because he or she can communicate with their respective constituency, bring them in to even get them to show up. And then what we do is we do some law enforcement 101 classes. For instance, we talk to them about the expectations at a traffic stop, because they're different all over the place. We talk to them about the expectations relative to domestic violence, which in some cultures, you know what I mean? The roles of males and females are significantly different. We talk to them about the roles of managing children. In some of the immigrant communities, I'll just tell you this, we had a gentleman who called us, indicated his son had been, was a runaway or possibly abducted, and we rolled out what's called a CART response, a child abduction response team, huge response. Well, in their culture, it is not uncommon for a youth to go to another family and stay with them for a period of time. That's exactly what had occurred. So we had to explain to the family, please tell us. See what I mean? Because we spin up all this stuff. So we're learning and we're adapting, but it is new to us. It really is. The cultural uniquenesses are diverse, but we are doing our best. And the approach is we want to understand how you believe, but we also desperately need you to understand how our system works, because miscommunications. I had a gentleman in my jail the other day that we had repeated use of force on. You know why? Because the last time he was in jail, he was tortured. And I'm heartbroken about it. I'm just, we didn't understand the underlying issues associated with this gentleman until we got in and got drilling down to it. And I'm ashamed to say that we didn't know it immediately, but how do you?
Time for 2 very quick questions, although I don't know if Jim Turner is capable of a quick question. Give it a shot, Jim.
Thank you, Jim. Next question. No, I'm just kidding. I got the vibe there, Reverend.
Very well done, Sheriff. I can't help but ponder. I think one of the inherent difficulties that law enforcement has in the disadvantaged communities is that uniform kind of represents the defense of the status quo, which they often perceive, and in fact, they are oppressed. And I wondered if there had been any thought given to helping your officers, especially in the environments that you talked about, the community events and what have you, having an open ear and a gentle, suggestive approach about how they might politically work to change the circumstance, to be more vocal in things like is going on in the legislature today, to try to help them understand how they have some opportunity. I don't know, just if there were just a perspective that the officers were afforded that might help them better instill and appreciate the opportunities that do exist.
So if I heard the question, let me try and assimilate it. The first issue is relative to the uniform, and you're exactly right. I mean, we do wear what is called a Class C uniform when we go out to many community events. And what a Class C is, it's a kind of a BDU pant with a kind of a golf shirt. And we do that intentionally to kind of signal that it's a little less intense. But I will tell you that it's important to me, and it should be important to you, to recognize that the appearance of the uniform and how that individual in the uniform is reacting does change hearts and minds, because they are making a direct impression. Uniform good, or uniform bad, uniform bad. We're trying to do it the other side of the coin. So we do work on that. The second issue, and again, I know you probably feel like I'm pointing the finger back at you, but I think I'm really pointing the finger back at all of us relative to society. And here is the interesting thing. We will talk to these immigrant groups, in fact, and we'll talk to them about the importance of becoming a citizen so they can vote and engage. And we'll hear back from them, well, you don't vote. Some of these cultures, sir, have higher voter participations than we do. You think I'm kidding you? And so, the point is it's kind of a hard message to get across to people to be civically engaged and get involved in your community when they're looking around at everybody else. And the people who they view as mainstream are not necessarily engaged themselves. Does that make sense? So we have to raise the collective, and then I think, just like everything else, individuals who are of different cultural background will assimilate to what our culture is. Right now, our culture is not exactly overly politically engaged. In fact, tend to believe that our political institutions are broken and corrupt.
Sheriff, our last question.
Hi, my name is Heidi. I am the widow of James D. Barker. And thank you for coming here today. I've never been in this church. I'm actually Quaker, but I'm so glad that you're before a congregation. I have a couple questions. Officer Matthew Taylor, from what I can see, and knowing James so closely, he was a very peaceful, loving man. He was a musician. He didn't even like to raise his voice. And to see him so startled and the fear in his eyes is something that I recognize as the fear for his life. And it wasn't just from Officer Matthew Taylor's words. I believe Officer Matthew, pulled that gun before his shovel was even lifted. And that kind of aggression is a mental illness in the department. Now, I've read over CIT manuals of crisis intervention training that you guys take. And I understand that officers come into situations with different tools. But in training, where is the compassion and dialogue? Where's the practice? And who do they practice with? And we also read that women officers bring different tools into dialogue. It says right there in your manuals that women actually have less escalation because they're able to not intervene with a hierarchy that the men usually do. How many women officers do you have on your force and actually go out and respond to these 911 calls? How many women do you recruit just for this single reason that is so needed right now? To have people that have the tools, like women, to realize that they don't need to engage in ego and power right away and, establish hierarchy, but actually understand and see through body language. James's body language was very open. I've been a social worker as well as James. James worked with children who had drug addiction problems before he became sick and incurred brain damage. I can tell by James's body language with his hands open and his shoulders shrugged, saying, if you don't want me here, I'll come back when it snows. That was a safe situation. So if you can answer me that question about women officers, maybe you can also go into how officers practice dialogue in your CIT training. Thank you.
Ma'am, first of all, from the bottom of my heart, and I mean this sincerely, I am terribly, terribly sorry for the tragedy and for the suffering of you and your family. And I would just say that there's probably nothing in the world that I could say to truly alleviate that. The death of a loved one, there's no answers, ma'am, that I could provide to take that away. Just know that I'm very sorry. As it relates to the individual questions that you mentioned, it is not just in CIT, but in CIT, training, which is a 40-hour curriculum, and it isn't much. The realities of our, I'm not trying to make excuses, but the realities of our budgeting process are to take an officer out of service for 40 hours for a particular curriculum is a rather significant impact. We are doing that. As we do that, that individual is engaging with individuals with specific mental illness under the direction of clinical professionals. They learn not only about the signs and symptoms of onset of mental illness, they talk about pharmacology, and that may sound silly. It helps them identify if an individual, if they respond to a house and someone says they are on a particular medication, what the impacts of that might be or what the underlying causative effect or their symptoms might be. In addition to that, they do engage with individuals that have diagnosed mental illness, and that is triaged or evaluated by a trainer. But again, ma'am, what I will say to you is that it all begins with the individual. I would love to tell you, and I'm not commenting on the reaction of this particular officer, ma'am. In all instances, in my opinion, it is predicated on the officer's inherent abilities and the skill sets that they both come with and evolve over time in law enforcement. As to females, you are correct that from a use of force perspective, it is accurate to say females are inherently involved in lesser use of force circumstances than the average male, for the reasons probably you've identified. But the idea that we would hire only or try and maximize female participation to resolve that, to me, it kind of belies what the real problem is, and that is we shouldn't try and get more females because they're different people. We should try and make males into little different people. So that's the, look, here, let me try and explain that. For a long time when it came to sexual violence, and we still do this today, what we say is we're going to go out and we're going to hold Lady Beware classes where we're going to tell females how not to be a victim. Well, wait a minute. Why don't we tell males not to victimize? And ma'am, I'm just going to tell you the same thing. The cultural, chemical, other factors that are associated with males before they're ever policemen or when they're policemen or after they're policemen, it is a situation, ma'am, those of us that have sons and daughters, you know, we know. It doesn't make them inherently bad. What we try and do is balance those two skill sets. So maybe that's not exactly the best answer. I believe we are well represented. I'd like more female officers, but I think we're well represented with them. What's that? How many? Well, ma'am, I have 500 sworn officers in the UPD, probably have 100 or so females. On the jail side, frankly, I think our female participation in our correctional staff is probably at a higher ratio. I can't give you the specific numbers, but you know, they're not 50-50, I'll tell you that. So to say it's demographically representative, it's not. The other thing is we hire who comes. And again, ma'am, I'm happy to stay as well after, and last word I'll say on it is I'm terribly, terribly sorry for you and the community and everybody relative to that. What is really a tragedy for everybody, ma'am.
Sheriff Winder, thank you very, very much for coming here. It's great.